The Romans believed that every doorway had a god watching over it. His name was Janus, and he had two faces. One looked forward, one looked back. He wasn't just the guardian of physical doors, he presided over all transitions, beginnings and endings, the start of the year, the moment a child becomes an adult, the instant war shifts to peace. Modern psychology has caught up to what the Romans understood intuitively. Transitions are not neutral moments. They carry unusual psychological weight. They reshape how we think, decide, and remember. Consider what happens when you walk through a doorway. Researchers at the University of Notre Dame discovered something strange in 2011. People who walked from one room to another were significantly more likely to forget what they had just been thinking about compared to people who walked the same distance within a single room. They called this the doorway effect. The architecture itself seemed to trigger a cognitive reset. Your brain treats the threshold as a boundary marker. It files away the previous context and prepares for something new. This isn't a flaw, it's a feature. Your mind is designed to segment experience into episodes. Doorways serve as natural chapter breaks. They tell your brain that the current scene has ended. In evolutionary terms, moving from one space to another often meant entering a different environment with different threats and opportunities. A savanna versus a forest. The inside of a cave versus open ground. Your ancestors, who paid sharp attention to these transitions and adjusted their mental state accordingly, had better odds of survival. Janus understood this. He was placed at doorways because doorways demand attention. They are where you shift gears. The threshold is not merely a location, it is a moment of heightened vulnerability and possibility. Now stretch that idea beyond physical space. Think about the start of a new year. Why does January 1st feel so weighted? Why do people make resolutions then and not on a random Tuesday in March? The answer is the fresh start effect. Research by Katie Milkman and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania shows that people are significantly more likely to pursue goal-directed behavior after temporal landmarks. The beginning of a week, a birthday, the first day of a semester. These moments function like doorways in time. They create a psychological sense of separation from past failures. You are no longer the person who didn't go to the gym last year. That was the old you. This is a new chapter. The effect is real and measurable. Google searches for the word diet spiked dramatically on January 1st. Gym attendance surges. The effect fades over weeks, but the initial boost is undeniable. The transition itself generates motivation. Janus is there at the threshold, and one of his faces is looking forward with fresh eyes. But there is a shadow side. Transitions also bring decision fatigue. When you stand at a threshold, you have to make choices. Which way to go, what to prioritize, how to behave in the new context. And decisions are metabolically expensive. Your prefrontal cortex burns glucose when it deliberates. String together too many transitions in a short span, and your capacity for good judgment deteriorates. This is why mornings are often the most mentally demanding part of the day. You are crossing threshold after threshold, from sleep to waking, from bed to bathroom, from home to commute. Each one asks something of you. Should I check my phone now or later? What should I wear? Should I eat breakfast or skip it? These are small decisions, but they accumulate. By the time you arrive at work, you may have already burned through a significant portion of your daily decision-making stamina. Researchers call this ego depletion, though the term is debated. What is less debated is that mental resources are finite within short time windows. Studies on judges reviewing parole cases found that approval rates dropped steadily as the day wore on, then spiked again after a meal break. The judges were not consciously biased. They were tired. Decisions became harder. The default answer became no. Janus does not promise that transitions will be easy. He simply watches. His presence is a reminder that thresholds demand something from you. They ask you to shift, to choose, to recalibrate. One practical takeaway here is to reduce trivial decisions at key transition points. Steve Jobs wore the same outfit every day, not because he lacked interest in fashion, but because he understood the cost of deliberation. Barack Obama did the same. They were protecting their cognitive resources for decisions that actually mattered. When you stand at the doorway between sleep and the day ahead, you want Janus looking forward with clarity, not squinting through a fog of breakfast cereal options. There is also the question of ritual. Romans made offerings to Janus at the start of important ventures. They understood that marking a transition explicitly helped the mind register its significance. Modern research supports this. Ritualized behavior before a performance, a competition, or even a difficult conversation reduces anxiety and improves focus. The ritual does not need to be elaborate. It just needs to be consistent. A deep breath, a specific phrase, a particular gesture. These acts serve as psychological doorways. They signal to your brain that you are crossing from one state into another. Athletes use this constantly. A basketball player's free throw routine. A tennis player bouncing the ball exactly 3 times before serving. The content of the ritual matters less than its presence. It is a way of telling Janus, I see this threshold. I am ready. Now consider endings. Janus looks backward as well as forward. His rear-facing head is not sentimental, it is vigilant. Endings also carry unusual weight. The peak end rule, identified by Daniel Kahneman and others, shows that people judge experiences largely based on their most intense moment and their final moment. The middle fades. The ending lingers. This has profound implications. A mediocre meal with a spectacular dessert will be remembered as a good meal. A painful medical procedure that ends with a few less painful moments will be remembered as less awful than one that ends at peak pain, even if the total pain was greater in the first case. Your memory does not average, it samples, and it samples heavily at boundaries. Romans understood this when they held elaborate funeral rites. The ending mattered. How you closed the story shaped what the story meant. Modern hospice care has rediscovered this. The quality of a person's final days can reshape how loved ones remember an entire lifetime. The threshold is not just a passage, it is a lens. What does this mean for daily life? It means endings deserve attention. How you close a meeting, how you finish a project, how you say goodbye. These moments are not formalities. They are high leverage points. Janus is watching both directions. If you stumble through the exit, that stumble will echo. One study on customer service found that the last interaction a customer has with a company predicts satisfaction far more powerfully than the average quality of all interactions. You can delight someone 9 times, but if the 10th interaction is dismissive, they leave unhappy. The doorway out matters as much as the doorway in. There is also the issue of unfinished transitions. Psychologist Bluma Zygarnik discovered that people remember incomplete tasks better than completed ones. The brain does not like open loops. An unfinished transition nags at you. You cross the threshold but never fully arrived. This is why cliffhangers work in storytelling. This is why unresolved arguments intrude on your thoughts. Janus is still standing there, one face looking at where you left off, waiting for closure. Practically, this means finishing what you start has cognitive benefits beyond mere productivity. It clears mental space. It lets you actually move through the doorway rather than hovering in the frame. If you cannot finish a task, at least define the next step clearly. That gives your brain permission to stop gnawing on it. Janus was also the god of war and peace. He presided over the transition between these states. The doors of his temple in Rome were kept open during wartime and closed during peace. For most of Roman history, those doors stayed open. War was the default state. Peace was the exception. But the transitions were marked. There was a moment when the state changed, a ritual, a recognition. This is worth sitting with. Conflict and resolution are transitions. They are not continuous states. There is a before and an after, and the moment between them is psychologically distinct. Research on conflict resolution shows that explicit acknowledgement of a shift, a handshake, an apology, an agreement, helps both parties move forward. Without that marker, people remain in a liminal state. The fight is over, but not finished. The peace has not actually begun. You see this in relationships. Couples who never clearly resolve an argument carry residue into the next interaction. The doorway was crossed halfway. Janus is still standing there with both faces looking at an unresolved moment. The argument did not end. It paused. Marking transitions cleanly is a skill. It requires noticing when a threshold appears and treating it with intention. This does not mean every transition needs ceremony, but the important ones do. The start of a new job, the end of a relationship, the moment you decide to pursue a new direction. These are Janus moments. Both faces should be engaged. Look back clearly. Look forward deliberately. Then, step through. The two faces also suggest something subtler. At any threshold, you are simultaneously who you were and who you are becoming. You are not one or the other. You are both. This is the paradox of identity during change. Research on self-continuity shows that people experience psychological distress when they feel disconnected from their past selves. Transition is not about erasure, it is about integration. Janus does not choose between his faces. He holds both. Fortune was a goddess with a wheel. She spun it constantly, and wherever it stopped determined your fate. Kings became beggars. Beggars became kings. The wheel turned without pattern, without mercy, without regard for virtue or effort. Romans prayed to Fortuna, built her temples, and understood something essential. Luck was real. It was powerful, and it was entirely outside your control. Except that is not quite how the human mind works. We are very bad at accepting randomness. We see patterns where none exist. We assign credit and blame where neither belongs. We mistake the spin of the wheel for something we influenced. Psychologists call this the illusion of control. It is the tendency to believe you have more influence over outcomes than you actually do. The classic experiment was conducted by Ellen Langer in the 1970s. She sold lottery tickets to office workers. Some people were allowed to choose their own numbers. Others were given numbers randomly. Later, she offered to buy the tickets back. The people who had chosen their own numbers demanded far more money. They believed their tickets were more valuable because they had selected them. But a lottery is random. Choosing your numbers does not change the odds. The wheel spins the same way regardless. This illusion is everywhere. Gamblers blow on dice. Investors believe they can time the market. Sports fans wear lucky jerseys. On some level, people know these actions do not affect outcomes, but the feeling persists. The need to believe you have a hand on the wheel is stronger than logic. Why does this happen? Part of it is evolutionary. Your ancestors lived in environments where their actions genuinely did affect outcomes. If you learned which plants were poisonous, you survived. If you practiced throwing a spear, you ate. Cause and effect were real and tight. Natural selection favored brains that looked for control, because control often existed. But that wiring does not turn off when you enter a casino or check your stock portfolio. Your brain still searches for patterns. It still wants to believe effort matters. This creates problems when randomness enters the picture. Consider the gambler's fallacy. A roulette wheel lands on black 5 times in a row. What do people bet on next? Red. They believe red is due. The wheel has been tilted toward black, so surely it will correct. But roulette wheels have no memory. Each spin is independent. The probability of red on the 6th spin is exactly the same as it was on the first, 50-50, minus the house edge. The fallacy works in reverse, too. If someone makes 3 successful stock trades in a row, they start to believe they have skill. They are reading the market. They have a feel for it. Fortuna has smiled on them not by chance, but because they are good. This is called the hot hand fallacy, named after basketball. Players and fans believe that a shooter who has made several baskets in a row is hot and more likely to make the next shot. Early research suggested this was an illusion. The probability of making the next basket did not actually increase after a streak. More recent studies complicate this, suggesting small hot hand effects might exist in some sports. But the broader point remains. People vastly overestimate streaks and vastly underestimate the role of randomness. This ties directly to attribution bias. When things go well, you credit your decisions. When things go poorly, you blame external factors. You got the promotion because you worked hard. You did not get it because the boss played favorites. Your investment paid off because you did smart research. It tanked because the market was irrational. Fortuna's wheel keeps spinning, but you narrate the results as if you were steering. Psychologists distinguish between internal and external locus of control. People with an internal locus believe outcomes are primarily determined by their actions. People with an external locus believe outcomes are determined by outside forces. Neither extreme is accurate. Reality is a mix. Some things you control, some things you do not. But humans are terrible at estimating the proportion. We inflate our control when we succeed and deflate it when we fail. There is a useful concept here called outcome bias. This is when you judge a decision based on its result, rather than the quality of the decision at the time it was made. A doctor chooses a treatment. The patient dies. Was it a bad decision? That depends. What was known at the time? What were the probabilities? What were the alternatives? If the treatment had a 90% success rate, and the patient fell into the unlucky 10%, the decision was still sound. But psychologically, people judge harshly. The wheel landed badly, so the doctor must have spun it wrong. This bias affects everything from hiring to parenting. A company hires someone who turns out to be excellent. The hiring manager is praised for good judgment. But what if the hire was a coin flip between 2 equally qualified candidates? The manager got lucky. Fortuna smiled. The wheel landed well. The outcome does not validate the process. In medicine, this becomes dangerous. A surgeon tries an unconventional approach. It works. Other surgeons copy the technique, but maybe the patient would have recovered anyway. Maybe the technique actually increased risk, and this one case was a statistical fluke. Outcome bias leads to bad protocols spreading because one spin of the wheel looked good. Romans had a phrase for this: Fortuna caeca est. Fortune is blind. She does not reward virtue. She does not punish vice. She spins. And humans, desperate for control, invent stories about why the wheel stopped where it did. One way to counter this is pre-mortems. Before a decision is made, imagine it has failed. Write down why. This forces you to think probabilistically. It separates the quality of the decision from the randomness of the outcome. A pre-mortem does not prevent bad luck, but it clarifies where your control actually lies. Another tool is base rates. Before you assess your chances, look at the overall statistics. If 90% of new restaurants fail within 2 years, your brilliant concept still faces those odds. You might beat them. You might have advantages, but you start from the base rate, not from your confidence. Fortuna's wheel does not care about your passion. There is also the concept of resulting, a term from poker. Resulting is when you evaluate a decision solely by whether it won or lost. A poker player goes all in on a weak hand and wins. Bad decision, good result. Another player folds a decent hand. The cards that would have come would have given them a winning hand. Good decision, bad result. Professional players train themselves to ignore results in the short term and focus on whether they are making probabilistically sound choices over hundreds of hands. They know the wheel spins many times. One outcome means nothing. This mindset is useful outside poker. If you make a good decision and it fails, do not abandon the process. If you make a bad decision and it succeeds, do not repeat it. The wheel will spin again. Over time, good process beats good luck. Romans also worshipped Fortuna in different aspects. Fortuna Redux brought you home safely. Fortuna Respiciens looked back favorably on your past. Fortuna Primigenia was the firstborn fortune, the luck you were given at birth. They understood that randomness was not one thing. It was woven through every part of life. You could not avoid it. You could only acknowledge it. Modern psychology has found that people who acknowledge luck are often more successful in the long run. This seems paradoxical. Shouldn't confidence breed success? Not always. People who credit luck for their successes remain humble. They keep learning. They do not assume the wheel will keep landing in their favor. People who credit only skill become overconfident. They take bigger risks. They stop adapting. When the wheel turns against them, they are blindsided. There is research on this in business. Jim Collins, in his study of companies that went from good to great, found that successful leaders consistently credited luck and other people for wins, while taking personal responsibility for losses. Unsuccessful leaders did the opposite. They took credit for success and blamed externals for failure. The pattern was striking. Acknowledging Fortuna's role did not weaken these leaders. It grounded them. This does not mean passivity. Romans still acted. They still strategized and worked and fought. But they did not confuse effort with certainty. You prepare the ship. You train the crew. You chart the course. Then you sail. And you know the wind might shift. Fortuna's wheel might spin against you. That is not failure. That is reality. One of the most insidious forms of the illusion of control is hindsight bias. After something happens, it feels inevitable. Of course the market crashed. The signs were there. Of course that relationship ended. It was doomed from the start. But before the event, the outcome was not clear. Hindsight bias makes the past look more predictable than it was. This warps your sense of control. You believe you should have known. You believe you could have acted differently. But you are judging past decisions with information you did not have at the time. This creates regret and self-blame. If the outcome was obvious in hindsight, then you must have been foolish not to see it. But the outcome was not obvious. The wheel had not yet stopped. Hindsight bias is Fortuna's cruelest trick. She makes you believe you had more control than you did, then punishes you for not using it. The antidote is intellectual humility. Recognize that the world is more random than it appears. Recognize that your successes are partly skill and partly luck. Recognize that your failures are partly mistakes and partly forces beyond your reach. This is not defeatism, it is realism. And realism lets you keep spinning without delusion. Fortuna's wheel will keep turning. You cannot stop it. You cannot predict where it will land. But you can choose how you interpret the results. You can resist the urge to narrate randomness as control. You can separate decision quality from outcome luck. You can prepare for the spin without pretending you control it. The Romans built temples to Fortuna not because she answered prayers, but because she reminded them of something true. The wheel spins, and you are not the one spinning it. In the center of Rome, 6 women tended a sacred flame. They were the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta, and their job was singular: keep the fire burning. If it went out, Rome itself was in danger. The city's safety, its prosperity, its very existence depended on that flame staying lit. These women were chosen as children, usually between the ages of 6 and 10. They served for 30 years. During that time, they were bound by a vow of chastity. If a Vestal broke that vow, the punishment was burial alive. If the flame went out on their watch, they were whipped. The role was both honored and terrifying. Vestals had privileges no other Roman women possessed. They could own property, they could make wills, their word in court carried weight. But the cost was absolute. Why did Romans invest so much in 6 women and a fire? The answer reveals something about how trust works, not just in Rome, but in any society. Vestals were not chosen for their fire-tending skill. They were chosen because their visible sacrifice made them credible. Their chastity was not about morality in a private sense. It was about creating a public signal that could not be faked. Modern research on trust and credibility points to a concept called costly signaling. The idea comes from biology originally. A peacock's tail is enormous and cumbersome. It makes the bird easier for predators to catch. But that is precisely why it works as a signal of fitness. Only a genuinely strong peacock can survive while dragging around that tail. The cost makes the signal honest. The Vestals were human costly signals. Their vow of chastity was expensive. It required real sacrifice. A woman who became a Vestal gave up marriage, children, and a normal life. She could not fake that commitment, and because she could not fake it, Romans trusted her. When a Vestal testified in court, people believed her. When she interceded for a prisoner, the request carried weight. Her credibility was purchased through visible, ongoing sacrifice. This is very different from how we often think about trust today. We tend to assume trust is built through competence. You trust your doctor because she went to medical school. You trust your mechanic because he fixed your car before. But competence is not enough when the stakes are high and verification is hard. You need something more. You need a signal that the person has skin in the game, that their incentives align with yours, that they cannot simply walk away if things go wrong. Consider modern institutions. Why do people trust universities? Partly because of competence, yes, but also because universities have invested enormous resources into buildings, endowments, reputations built over decades or centuries. They cannot easily pick up and leave. They have made a costly commitment to being credible over the long term. A fly-by-night online diploma mill has not. It can vanish. It has no costly signal, so people do not trust it the same way. Or think about wedding rings. Why do people spend significant money on them? A ring is not functionally necessary for a marriage, but it serves as a costly signal. It says, I have invested in this commitment. The expense is the point. If rings were cheap and disposable, they would lose their symbolic power. The Vestals understood this. Their entire lives were the ring. There is another layer here. The Vestals were not just individuals. They were representatives of something larger. The sacred flame they tended symbolized Rome's continuity. As long as it burned, Rome endured. The flame was a tangible, visible marker of the state's health. And the Vestals, through their sacrifice, became the guarantors of that symbol. This matters because trust in abstract institutions is hard. You cannot see Rome as an entity. You cannot shake hands with the state. But you can see 6 women in white robes tending a flame. You can watch them live lives of discipline and sacrifice. They make the abstract concrete. They give the institution a human face. And because their commitment is visible and costly, you trust that the institution they represent is stable. Modern psychology recognizes this as the identifiable victim effect in reverse. People respond more strongly to individual, specific stories than to abstract statistics. One child in need moves you more than 1,000 children in need. The Vestals work the same way. They were 6 specific people whose sacrifice you could witness. That made Rome's continuity feel real and protected. But there is a darker side. The punishment for a Vestal who broke her vow was brutal. She was not simply executed. She was buried alive in a small chamber with a bit of bread and water, then sealed in. The man involved was publicly beaten to death. This was not about justice in any proportional sense. It was about maintaining the signal. If a Vestal could break her vow without extreme consequences, the entire system collapsed. Her credibility, and by extension the credibility of Rome itself, required absolute enforcement. This reveals something uncomfortable about costly signaling. It only works if the cost is real and enforced. If society tolerates exceptions, the signal degrades. Everyone knows the vow is not truly binding, and once that knowledge spreads, trust evaporates. The Vestals' power came from the certainty that they could not cheat. That certainty was maintained through terror. Modern institutions face a version of this problem. When banks are bailed out after risky behavior, the costly signal breaks down. The institution has not truly paid for its mistakes. The next time it promises to be responsible, people trust it less. When politicians face no consequences for broken promises, their words lose weight. The signal requires the cost to be genuine. Otherwise, it is just noise. There is also the question of who gets to be a costly signal. The Vestals were chosen young, trained for decades, and held to standards no one else faced. They were set apart. This created a class of people whose entire identity was bound up in credibility. They had no other life to fall back on. Their incentive to maintain the signal was total. You see this in other contexts. Judges in many systems have lifetime appointments and substantial barriers to removal. This makes them costly signals of impartiality. They are not worried about the next election. They are not angling for a promotion. Their investment in the role is long-term and public. This does not guarantee they are impartial, but it shifts the incentives. The cost of the position makes the signal more believable. Or think about monks and nuns in various religious traditions. Their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience are costly signals of devotion. They have given up worldly pursuits. That sacrifice makes their spiritual authority credible to believers. A priest who lives in luxury does not carry the same weight. The signal is weak because the cost is low. The Vestals also had a monopoly. There were only 6 of them at any given time. This scarcity increased their value. If every woman in Rome were a Vestal, the role would lose its specialness. The sacrifice would be diluted. Costly signals work partly because they are rare. Not everyone can afford to send them. This has implications for how we build trust in modern settings. If you want to be seen as credible, You need to make a visible, meaningful investment that others can observe and that you cannot easily fake or walk away from. This might be time, it might be money, it might be reputation, but it has to cost you something real. Consider online reviews. Why do people trust detailed, thoughtful reviews more than one-sentence reviews? Because a detailed review costs time and effort. It is a costly signal that the reviewer actually used the product and cares enough to share a thorough opinion. A quick 5-star rating costs almost nothing. It could be fake. The signal is cheap, so trust is low. Or think about apologies. A genuine apology often includes restitution or some form of penance. That makes it costly. A cheap apology, just words with no consequence, does not rebuild trust. The Vestals knew this. Their entire lives were penance in advance. They could never be accused of a cheap commitment. But costly signaling has limits. It can create rigidity. The Vestals could not leave their roles easily. Their lives were constrained by the very sacrifice that made them credible. And if the signal becomes too costly, no one volunteers. Rome had to offer privileges to make the role attractive despite the restrictions. The credibility was not free. It was purchased with a complex package of honor, status, and legal rights. There is also the risk of fetishizing the signal over the substance. If people focus too much on the visible sacrifice, they might miss whether the actual job is being done well. Did the Vestals tend the flame competently? Or did Romans just assume they did because the women had given up so much? Costly signals can create a halo effect. The sacrifice becomes proof of competence, even when the two are not directly linked. Modern organizations struggle with this. A CEO who takes a $1 salary signals commitment. But does that mean the CEO is making good decisions? Not necessarily. The signal and the skill are separate, yet people conflate them. The visible sacrifice makes everything else seem more credible. The Vestals were also a check on power. They could intervene in executions. If a condemned prisoner happened to encounter a Vestal on the way to execution, the Vestal could grant a pardon on the spot. This was rare but significant. It meant that even the state's power to kill was not absolute. A Vestal, through her accumulated credibility, could override it. Her costly signal gave her authority that transcended normal political channels. This suggests that credibility, when built through genuine sacrifice, can create moral authority independent of formal power. The Vestals held no elected office, they commanded no armies, but their word mattered because everyone knew the price they had paid to speak it. In the end, the Vestal virgins were a technology for manufacturing trust. They turned individual sacrifice into collective confidence. They made an abstract state legible and believable. They reminded Romans daily that some things were worth protecting at great personal cost. And they demonstrated that credibility is not given. It is earned through visible, sustained, and genuinely expensive commitment. The flame burned because someone was willing to sacrifice everything to keep it lit. And Rome trusted that as long as the flame burned and the Vestals watched, the city would endure. Romans told stories about a golden age, long before the Republic, before the kings. There was a time when Saturn ruled. The god had been overthrown by his son Jupiter and fled to Italy. There he established a kingdom of perfect peace. No one owned property. No one worked the fields. The earth gave fruit freely. There were no laws because there was no crime. No one was rich. No one was poor. Everyone lived in harmony. It was paradise. Then Saturn's reign ended. The Golden Age gave way to silver, then bronze, then iron. Each age was worse than the last. By the time historical Romans told this story, they believed they were living in the Iron Age, an age of war, greed, and suffering. The perfection was gone, and it was never coming back. This myth appears in many cultures: the Garden of Eden, the age of the gods in Hesiod, a primordial time when everything was better. Psychologists call the modern version of this rosy retrospection. It is the tendency to remember the past as better than it actually was, and it is nearly universal. Studies show that people rate past experiences more positively in memory than they did while actually living them. A vacation that was stressful at the time becomes a cherished memory. A difficult period in life gets softened. The bad parts fade. The good parts intensify. This is not deliberate lying. It is how memory works. Your brain does not store a neutral recording. It stores a reconstruction. And that reconstruction is biased toward making the past look rosier than it was. Why does this happen? Part of it is emotional regulation. If you remembered every bad experience with full intensity, you would be paralyzed. The past would be unbearable. So your brain smooths it out. It highlights peaks and endings and lets the rough middle blur. This helps you move forward, but it also distorts your sense of history. The danger is when rosy retrospection scales up to entire societies. Collective nostalgia is the belief that society as a whole was better in some earlier era. Every generation seems to believe this. Ancient Romans longed for Saturn's reign. Medieval Europeans romanticized antiquity. Victorians idealized the countryside before industrialization. Today, people pine for the 1950s or the 1980s, or whatever era they associate with stability. This nostalgia warps decision-making. If you believe the past was better, you focus on restoration rather than innovation. You try to bring back what was lost instead of building something new. Political movements often run on nostalgia. Make America great again. Take back control. Return to traditional values. The language is always backward-looking. The golden age is behind us. We just need to find our way back. But the golden age never existed. Or more precisely, it existed only in selective memory. The 1950s in America had post-war prosperity for some, yes, but also segregation, limited opportunities for women, and the constant threat of nuclear war. The Victorian countryside was not idyllic. It was marked by poverty, disease, and back-breaking labor. Saturn's reign never happened. It was a story Romans told to express dissatisfaction with the present. Psychologists have identified a specific bias called temporal comparison. People compare their current situation not to objective reality, but to a remembered past. And because that remembered past is rosier than the actual past, the present always suffers by comparison. You are not comparing today to yesterday as it really was. You are comparing today to a gilded memory of yesterday. The present loses every time. This has real consequences. Research on happiness shows that people who focus on how things used to be report lower life satisfaction than people who focus on the present or future. The nostalgia trap keeps you oriented toward an imaginary past that you can never return to. It prevents you from fully engaging with what is actually in front of you. There is also the concept of declinism. This is the belief that things are getting worse over time. Morality is declining. Culture is degrading. The youth are more selfish than previous generations. This belief is ancient. Every generation thinks it. The Roman poet Horace wrote that each generation was worse than the one before. He was writing 2,000 years ago. If he were right, humanity would have degenerated into total chaos by now. Yet, here we are. Surveys show that people consistently rate the past as morally superior to the present and predict the future will be even worse. But objective measures often contradict this. Crime rates fluctuate but have dropped dramatically over the long term in many places. Literacy has exploded globally. Life expectancy has soared. Child mortality has plummeted. By many metrics, the world is better now than it has ever been. Yet the feeling persists that we have fallen from grace. Why? Part of it is availability bias. Bad news is more salient. It sticks in memory. You hear about a crime and it feels like crime is everywhere. You do not hear about the 10,000 people who went about their day safely. So your perception of the present is skewed negative. But your memory of the past does not work that way. You do not remember every boring, safe day from 20 years ago. You remember highlights, holidays, celebrations, moments of joy. The boring and the bad fade out. The past looks golden because you are comparing today's full reality to yesterday's edited highlights. There is also the reminiscence bump. People tend to remember events from adolescence and early adulthood more vividly than events from other periods of life. This is the time when you are forming your identity. Everything feels intense. Music sounds better. Friendships feel deeper. Experiences are formative. So when you look back, that period glows. And because that period was decades ago, you associate the glow with the era, not with your age. You think the 1980s were amazing, but really, being 16 was amazing. The era is incidental. This tricks entire generations. Baby boomers remember the 60s fondly and assume the world was better then. Generation X romanticizes the 90s. Millennials are starting to do the same. Each group is mistaking the intensity of youth for the quality of the times. Saturn's golden age is just adolescence projected backward. The myth also serves a psychological function. It gives you someone to blame for the fall. If there was a golden age, then something or someone ruined it. You can point to a cause: immigrants, technology, moral decay, capitalism, whatever fits your narrative. This is more satisfying than accepting that life is complex and has always been a mix of good and bad. Nostalgia provides a clear story. We had paradise, we lost it. We can get it back if we just undo the mistake. But history does not work that way. There was no singular moment when things went wrong. There was no golden age to lose. Change is constant. Some changes improve life. Some make it harder. Most are mixed. The Iron Age was not a fall from grace. It was just a different age with different challenges. One way to counter the nostalgia trap is to examine the past honestly. Not as a collection of sanitized memories, but as it actually was. Read diaries from the era you romanticize. Look at mortality statistics. Understand what daily life involved. You will find that every era had its suffering. Every generation faced problems. The golden age dissolves under scrutiny. Another tool is gratitude for the present. This does not mean ignoring real problems. It means recognizing what works now that did not work before. Anesthesia, antibiotics, indoor plumbing. The ability to communicate instantly across continents. These are not trivial. They represent enormous improvements over the past. Acknowledging them does not make you complacent, it makes you accurate. There is also value in focusing on trajectory rather than comparison. Instead of asking whether now is better than some mythical past, Ask whether things are improving. Are we solving problems? Are we learning? Are we building? The direction matters more than the snapshot, and by many measures, the direction is positive, even if the present is imperfect. The Romans also had a counterweight to the Golden Age myth. They celebrated their own republic as a time of virtue and discipline. They held up ancestors like Cincinnatus, who left his farm to lead Rome in crisis and then returned to his plow. They valorized the past, but it was a specific, historical past, not a mythical one. This grounded their nostalgia in something concrete. It gave them models to emulate rather than an impossible ideal to mourn. Modern nostalgia often lacks that grounding. It is vague. The past was just better. People were kinder. Life was simpler. These claims are unfalsifiable because they are not specific. You cannot examine them. You cannot learn from them. They simply sit there, making the present feel inadequate. Saturn's golden age was also an age without progress. No one built anything because everything was already perfect. No one invented anything because there was no need. It was static. And humans are not built for stasis. We need challenge. We need problems to solve. A world without friction is a world without meaning. This is the deepest problem with the nostalgia trap. It is not just that the past was not as good as you remember. It is that even if it were, you would not want to live there. You would be bored. You would chafe against the limits. You would long for something more. The Golden Age is appealing only from a distance. Up close, it would feel like a cage. The Iron Age has its virtues. It is an age of striving, of building, of figuring things out. Yes, it is harder than paradise, but it is also more interesting, and ultimately, more human. Saturn's reign was for gods. The Iron Age is for people who have to work and choose and fail and try again. That is not a fall. That is just life. And it is enough. In every Roman household, there were small gods. They did not live on Mount Olympus. They did not command storms or shape the fates of nations. They lived in the corners of your home, in the hearth, in the doorway, in the pantry. They were the lares, the household deities, and Romans honored them daily with small offerings. A bit of food, a splash of wine, a whispered prayer before a meal. These rituals were not grand. They took minutes, but they were constant. Day after day, year after year, the lares received their due. And in return, they protected the home. They kept the family safe. They maintained order in the small space where life actually happened. Modern psychology has caught up to what the Romans understood. Small, repeated rituals shape behavior far more powerfully than occasional grand gestures. The structure of daily life matters, and the way you mark that structure, the tiny habits you perform without thinking, determines much of who you become. Consider habit formation. Research by Wendy Wood and others shows that roughly 40 to 45% of daily behavior is habitual. You are not making conscious decisions, you are running patterns. Wake up, check phone, brush teeth, make coffee. These actions happen automatically. They are triggered by context, not by intention. And once a habit is established, it is remarkably stable. It takes significant effort to break. The layers worked as environmental cues. The small shrine in the home, the lararium, was a physical reminder to perform the ritual. You walked past it, you saw it. The environment prompted the behavior. This is how habits are built, not through willpower or motivation, but through context and repetition. The cue triggers the routine. The routine delivers a reward. The loop strengthens. Modern habit research emphasizes this. If you want to build a habit, you need a clear, cue. James Clear, synthesizing decades of behavioral science, talks about implementation intentions. Not just, I will exercise, but after I pour my morning coffee, I will do 10 push-ups. The cue is specific. The behavior is linked to a context. The lares functioned exactly this way. The lararium was the cue. The offering was the behavior. The sense of protection and order was the reward. The offerings themselves were small. Romans were not sacrificing bulls at home. They were setting aside a piece of bread, a few drops of wine. The cost was minimal, but the consistency was everything. This aligns with what behavior scientists now know about sustainable habits. Big, ambitious goals often fail because they require too much effort. Small, easy actions succeed because they can be repeated indefinitely. B.J. Fogg's research on tiny habits shows that starting small is not a compromise. It is the strategy. Want to floss your teeth? Start with one tooth. Want to meditate? Start with one breath. The point is not the single tooth or the single breath. The point is establishing the pattern. Once the behavior is automatic, you can scale it up. But if you start too big, you burn out. The lares did not demand hours of prayer. They demanded presence, attention, a moment of acknowledgement. There is also the question of meaning. The offerings to the lares were not purely mechanical. They carried significance. You were honoring the gods of your home. You were acknowledging that your daily life had sacred dimensions. This transformed mundane actions into something larger. The meal was not just food. It was a shared moment with the divine. Modern psychology recognizes this as ritualization. When you turn a behavior into a ritual, you change its psychological weight. A ritual has boundaries. It has a beginning and an end. It has intention. Research shows that rituals reduce anxiety, increase focus, and improve performance. Athletes have pre-game rituals. Musicians have warm-up routines. Surgeons have protocols before entering the operating room. These are not superstitions. They are psychological tools. They help you shift mental states. They signal to your brain that something important is about to happen. The lares ritual did this for daily life. It marked the transition from waking to the day's work, from work to the evening meal. It created psychological structure, and structure, even small structure, reduces decision fatigue. You do not have to figure out how to start your day. You already know. You honor the lares. Then you begin. Neuroscience supports this. When a behavior becomes habitual, it shifts from the prefrontal cortex, which handles deliberate decision-making, to the basal ganglia, which handles automatic processes. This frees up cognitive resources. You are not spending mental energy on whether to make coffee. You just make coffee. The lares ritual became automatic in the same way. It did not drain willpower. It conserved it. There is also a social dimension. Roman families performed the lares ritual together. This created shared rhythm. Everyone participated. Everyone knew the pattern. This strengthened family cohesion. You were not just individuals living in the same space. You were a unit with shared practices. Research on family rituals shows that they predict better outcomes for children. Not elaborate vacations or expensive traditions. Simple, regular practices. Eating dinner together. Reading before bed. A consistent weekend routine. These small patterns create stability. They give children a sense of predictability in a chaotic world. And they build identity. We are the family that does this. The lares ritual worked the same way. It defined the household. But rituals can also become empty. If you perform them without attention, they lose power. This is the risk of any repeated behavior. It becomes rote. You go through the motions. The Romans understood this risk. The ritual had to be performed with intention. The offering had to be genuine, even if small. This is why the reward mattered. The sense of protection, the feeling of honoring something important, kept the ritual alive. Modern habit science talks about this as intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is external reward. You floss because the dentist will praise you. Intrinsic motivation is internal. You floss because it makes your mouth feel clean. Intrinsic motivation is far more sustainable. The Lares ritual worked because the reward was internal. You felt connected to your home. You felt you were maintaining order. That feeling was enough. There is also the concept of keystone habits. These are habits that trigger other positive behaviors. Charles Duhigg writes about this in his work on habit formation. Exercise is a keystone habit for many people. Once they start exercising regularly, they also start eating better, sleeping better, being more productive. The single habit cascades. The Lares ritual may have functioned this way. Starting the day with intention and attention set the tone. It primed you to act with care throughout the day. The size of the ritual also protected it. Because it was small, it survived disruption. A major religious festival might be canceled due to war or crisis, but the household offering continued. It was resilient. This is another principle from habit research. Simple habits withstand stress better than complex ones. When life gets chaotic, you do not have bandwidth for elaborate routines, but you can still perform the tiny ritual. And that continuity, that thread of normalcy, can be stabilizing. There is a darker side to consider. Rituals can become compulsions. When the behavior is no longer serving you, but you feel compelled to perform it anyway, it has crossed a line. Obsessive-compulsive disorder involves rituals that have spiraled out of control. The person knows the ritual does not logically protect them, but they cannot stop. Anxiety if they skip it is overwhelming. The Lares ritual stayed healthy because it was culturally supported and bounded. It had a clear purpose. It did not expand into irrationality. Modern secular life often lacks these small daily rituals. People search for meaning in big experiences, vacations, achievements, major life events. But the texture of daily life is where you actually live. And without small rituals to structure it, days blur together. You lose the sense of rhythm. The Lares reminded Romans that every day had shape. Morning, midday, evening. Each marked, each honored. You can build your own Lares. Not literal gods, but small, consistent practices that anchor your day. A morning routine, a moment of gratitude before meals, a few minutes of reading before bed. These do not need to be elaborate. They need to be consistent. They need to be cued by your environment. They need to carry some small sense of meaning, even if just the meaning that this is how you start or end your day. The power is in the repetition. One offering to the Lares means nothing. 10,000 offerings create a life. The Lares did not promise miracles. They promised that if you showed up, day after day, they would hold the space. And in that held space, a home became more than walls. It became a place where small gods lived and small rituals mattered, and the accumulated weight of tiny attentions built something solid and enduring. That is not superstition. That is architecture for a human life. Minerva was the goddess of wisdom, and her sacred animal was an owl. But the owl did not fly at dawn. It flew at dusk. Minerva's bird took flight only when the day was ending, when the shadows grew long and the work was done. The philosopher Hegel picked up this image centuries later and made it explicit. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. Wisdom comes late. Understanding arrives after the fact. This captures something uncomfortable about how human cognition works. You do not understand what you are living through while you are living through it. You understand it later, looking back, when it is too late to change course. The moment of clarity comes when action is no longer possible. Psychologists call one version of this hindsight bias. After an event occurs, it feels inevitable. You believe you knew it all along. The signs were obvious. You should have seen it coming. But this is an illusion. Before the event, the outcome was not clear. There were multiple possibilities. Hindsight collapses those possibilities into a single path and makes that path look predetermined. Research demonstrates this repeatedly. When people are told the outcome of a historical event or a psychological experiment, they report that they would have predicted that outcome, even when the actual outcome was surprising or counterintuitive. Even when, before being told, they predicted something different. The knowledge of what happened rewrites the memory of what seemed likely. This is not dishonesty. It is how memory reconstruction works. Your brain integrates new information and adjusts the past to fit. The danger is that hindsight bias distorts learning. If you believe you knew all along, you do not examine why you failed to act on that knowledge. You do not update your models. You just blame yourself for not listening to what you now falsely remember as obvious warnings. This creates regret without insight. You feel foolish, but you do not get smarter. There is a related phenomenon called the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it becomes nearly impossible to imagine not knowing it. Teachers struggle with this. Experts struggle with this. You explain something and it seems simple to you. Why does the student not get it? But the student does not have the framework you have built over years. The knowledge that seems obvious to you now was not obvious when you started. You have forgotten what it was like not to know. The owl of Minerva flies at dusk because wisdom requires perspective, and perspective requires distance. You cannot see the shape of something while you are inside it. You have to step back, or wait, or finish. Only then does the pattern become visible. This is why memoirs are written late in life, why historians study periods that have ended, why therapists help you process the past, not predict the future. The meaning emerges in retrospect, but there is a cost. If wisdom comes late, it cannot guide action in the moment. You make decisions with incomplete information. You act without fully understanding. Then later, when the owl finally flies, you see what you should have done. But the moment has passed. This is the tragedy of human knowledge. We are always playing catch-up with our own experience. Consider the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with low competence in a domain overestimate their skill. People with high competence underestimate theirs. The least skilled are the most confident. The most skilled are the most uncertain. Why? Because skill includes the ability to recognize what you do not know. When you are incompetent, you lack the metacognitive ability to assess your own incompetence. You do not know what you do not know. So you feel confident. You think the task is simple. You believe you have mastered it. As you gain expertise, you encounter the complexity you could not see before. You discover edge cases, exceptions, nuances. Your confidence drops. You realize how much more there is to learn. Eventually, with deep expertise, confidence rises again. But it is a different kind of confidence. It is grounded in knowledge of the territory, including its uncertainties. The owl has flown. You can see the landscape. This creates a paradox for decision-making. The people most confident in their judgment are often the least qualified. The people most qualified are often the most hesitant. And there is no easy way around this. You cannot skip the incompetent confidence phase. You have to live through it. The owl will not fly until dusk. You cannot summon it early. One partial solution is intellectual humility. Assume you are in the Dunning-Kruger trough. Assume you do not yet know what you do not know. This does not paralyze you, it just makes you cautious. You act, but you build in feedback loops. You test assumptions. You seek disconfirming evidence. You do not wait for the owl to fly, but you acknowledge that it has not yet. There is also the issue of reflection. Wisdom requires time to think, not just to experience, but to process experience. The owl flies at dusk because dusk is when you stop and look back. If you are constantly in motion, constantly taking in new information, you never let the owl take flight. You never consolidate. You never extract the lesson. Research on learning supports this. Spacing and reflection improve retention far more than continuous input. If you study something for an hour, then take a break and reflect, you will remember it better than if you study for 2 hours straight. The break is not wasted time. It is when consolidation happens. The owl needs the dusk. It cannot fly in broad daylight while you are still acting. Modern life often denies this. There is always more to do, more information to process, more decisions to make. You move from one thing to the next without pause. The owl never gets a chance to fly. You accumulate experience, but do not gain wisdom. You are always at noon, never at dusk. This is exhausting and ultimately unproductive. Without reflection, experience does not teach, it just accumulates. Journaling is one way to create artificial dusk. You stop, you write, you process what happened, you ask what it means. This is not just documentation, it is sense-making. The act of writing forces you to organize your thoughts, to see patterns, to extract lessons. The owl flies in the margins of your notebook. Another tool is the after-action review. Militaries use this, teams use this. After a project or event, you gather and ask 3 questions. What did we expect to happen? What actually happened? What accounts for the difference? This structured reflection accelerates the owl's flight. You do not have to wait years for wisdom. You create space for it immediately after the event while memory is still fresh. But some wisdom genuinely cannot come early. You cannot understand a marriage from the outside. You cannot understand parenthood before you become a parent. You cannot understand aging until you age. Some knowledge requires living through the thing itself. The owl will not fly until you have crossed the terrain. No amount of reading or listening can substitute for direct experience. This is humbling. It means every generation has to learn certain lessons for itself. You can tell someone what to expect, but they will not truly understand until they experience it. Then they will have their own dusk moment, their own owl flight, and they will say, "Now I see what you meant." But by then, they are past the moment when the knowledge would have been most useful. There is also the problem of premature explanation. When you try to understand something too quickly, you lock in a shallow interpretation. You think you have figured it out. The owl has flown. But it was a false flight. A smaller bird that looked like an owl in dim light. Later, with more information, you realize your initial explanation was wrong. But it has already shaped your actions. You built on a faulty foundation. This is why scientists emphasize replication and patience. Do not conclude too quickly. Let the data accumulate. Let the patterns emerge. Wait for dusk. Not the first shadow, but actual dusk. The owl of Minerva does not fly at 4 in the afternoon. It flies when the day is truly done. In practice, this means tolerating ambiguity. Most of life does not come with clear explanations in real time. You are in the middle of something, and you do not know what it means yet. You do not know if this relationship will last. You do not know if this job is right. You do not know if you are making the correct choice. The owl has not flown. You are still in daylight or twilight, and you have to act anyway. This is the human condition. You make decisions before you have wisdom. Then later you gain wisdom but cannot unmake the decisions. The owl shows you the landscape after you have already crossed it. There is no way around this. The best you can do is acknowledge it. Act with humility. Build in reversibility where possible. And when dusk finally comes, when the owl spreads its wings and you see clearly, use that clarity not to torture yourself with regret, but to inform the next crossing. Because there will always be another journey, another stretch of daylight, another dusk. And maybe next time, when the owl flies, you will recognize the terrain a little faster. That is not wisdom in the moment, but it is wisdom across a lifetime, and that is all the owl ever promised. There was a monster in Roman mythology named Cacus. He lived in a cave on the Aventine Hill and terrorized the countryside. He breathed fire. He ate human flesh. He was the son of Vulcan, god of the forge, and he used his father's gift for destruction. But Cacus had one particular trick that made him especially dangerous. When he stole cattle, he dragged them backward into his cave by their tails. The hoof prints led away from the cave, not toward it. Anyone tracking the stolen animals would follow the trail in the wrong direction. The theft was invisible. Hercules eventually killed Cacus, but the myth stayed in Roman consciousness. The idea of someone covering their tracks by reversing the evidence, making the hidden look exposed, making the crime look like it happened somewhere else. This image maps onto something psychology has confirmed. Deception is cognitively expensive, and that expense leaves traces. When you lie, your brain has to do extra work. It has to construct a false narrative. It has to suppress the true narrative. It has to monitor whether the listener believes you. It has to keep the two stories separate so you do not contradict yourself. All of this requires cognitive resources. And when cognitive resources are stretched, performance degrades. Research on cognitive load and deception shows this clearly. Liars take longer to answer questions. They provide fewer details. They make more speech errors. They blink differently. Their stories are less complex. This is not because they are bad at lying necessarily. It is because lying is harder than telling the truth. The truth is already encoded in memory. You just retrieve it. A lie has to be created on the spot and maintained in working memory while you speak. That takes effort, and effort shows. Law enforcement has long tried to exploit this. Polygraphs measure physiological arousal. Voice stress analysis listens for microtremors. Behavioral analysis looks for inconsistencies. But these methods are imperfect. Nervous truth-tellers can look like liars. Skilled liars can stay calm. The traces are real, but they are not perfectly reliable. Cacus dragged the cattle backward, but eventually Hercules noticed that the tracks looked wrong. The deception left a mark, even if it was subtle. One robust finding is that liars provide fewer details. When you tell the truth, you include contextual information, what the weather was like, what you were wearing, irrelevant tangents that came to mind because they were actually there in the memory. When you lie, you stick to the script. You provide only the necessary information. You avoid elaboration because elaboration increases the chance of contradiction. The story is cleaner, too clean. Aldert Vrij, a psychologist who studies deception, uses this. He asks suspects to tell their story in reverse chronological order. Start with the end and work backward. This is easy if you are recalling something that actually happened. Memory is flexible. You can access it in any order. But if you are constructing a lie, reverse order is much harder. You built the story forward. Reversing it taxes cognitive load even further. Inconsistencies appear. Details drop out. The liar struggles. Kakis's trick only worked in one direction. There is also the problem of concealment effort. When you are hiding something, you have to actively suppress cues. Do not look away. Do not touch your face. Do not shift in your seat. But suppression itself is a cognitive task. It competes for resources. The more you try to control your behavior, the less bandwidth you have for managing the content of your lie. Something leaks. Maybe not in the way you expected, but somewhere. This is why good interrogators do not just look for obvious tells. They look for places where cognitive load spikes. They ask unexpected questions. They change topics suddenly. They ask for details the liar did not prepare. Each of these increases load. An increased load increases the chance of a mistake. The hoofprints start to look odd. The direction does not quite make sense. But deception is not always person to person. Sometimes it is institutional. Companies hide financial problems. Governments conceal failures. The mechanisms are similar but scaled. The organization has to maintain two narratives, the public one and the real one. This requires coordination. Everyone has to stay on script. The more people involved, the harder this becomes. Someone forgets the cover story. Someone lets a detail slip. The tracks start to diverge. Whistleblowers often emerge not because they are morally superior, but because they are cognitively exhausted. Maintaining a lie, even a collective one, is draining. It wears on you. Eventually, someone decides the effort is not worth it. They reveal the truth not out of heroism necessarily, but out of a desire to stop carrying the cognitive burden. Kakis lived alone in his cave. He did not have to coordinate his deception with anyone. Once you involve multiple people, the system becomes fragile. There is also self-deception. This is a strange concept. How can you lie to yourself? You know the truth, but people do it constantly. You convince yourself you are not attracted to someone when you are. You tell yourself you are happy in a job you hate. You believe you are generous when your actual behavior is selfish. The mechanism seems to be compartmentalization. The truth is stored in one part of your mind. The false narrative is maintained in another. You avoid situations that would force you to reconcile them. Self-deception reduces cognitive load in the short term. If you genuinely believe your own lie, you do not have to work to maintain it. You are not suppressing anything. You simply do not access the contradictory information. But this creates long-term problems. The truth does not disappear. It sits there, and eventually something forces you to confront it. A crisis, a confrontation, a moment when the compartments collapse, and then the cognitive cost arrives all at once. It is painful, disorienting. The hoof prints suddenly point the wrong way, and you do not know how you missed it. There is research suggesting that self-deception can actually make you a better liar to others. If you believe your own story, you do not show the cognitive load of deception. You are not lying. You are just wrong. This is evolutionarily advantageous in some contexts. The person who genuinely believes their own self-serving narrative is more convincing than the person who knows they are lying. But it is also dangerous. You make decisions based on false information. You double down on mistakes because you do not recognize them as mistakes. Organizations exploit this. If you can get people to internalize the narrative, they will defend it more effectively than if they know it is a cover story. Cult leaders do this. Authoritarian regimes do this. Corporate cultures do this. The lie becomes the reality for the people inside. They drag the cattle backward and genuinely do not see the problem. The tracks look normal to them. Only outsiders notice the direction is wrong. One way to detect hidden behavior, your own or others, is to look for energy expenditure. Where is effort being applied that should not be necessary? If someone is working very hard to convince you of something mundane, ask why. If you find yourself exhausted by a relationship or a job but cannot articulate why, ask what you are suppressing. Cognitive load does not disappear. It shows up somewhere, maybe as fatigue, maybe as irritability, maybe as avoidance. Cacus had to physically drag the cattle backward. That took effort. The effort was a clue. Another approach is to test narratives by increasing load. Ask for details. Ask for the story in a different order. Introduce unexpected information and see how the narrative adjusts. Truth is robust. It can handle complexity. Lies are brittle. They were designed for a specific set of questions. When you ask something off script, the lie fractures. The hoofprints start pointing both directions at once. But detection has limits. Sophisticated liars prepare. They rehearse. They reduce cognitive load by practicing the false narrative until it becomes as automatic as the truth. Spies do this. Con artists do this. They live the lie so deeply that the usual markers of deception fade. At that point, detection becomes much harder. You are not looking for cognitive load. You are looking for inconsistencies in the story itself. And if the story was carefully constructed, those inconsistencies might not exist. Cacus was eventually caught, not because his hoofprints gave him away, but because Hercules heard the stolen cattle bellowing inside the cave. The deception was good, but the hidden truth still made noise. The broader lesson is that secrecy and deception are visible if you know where to look. Not always, not perfectly, but they leave marks. They require effort. They create load. They shape behavior in detectable ways. The hoofprints point backward, and that backward direction is itself information. Cacus thought he was clever. He thought reversing the tracks made the theft invisible. But reversal is not invisibility. It is a different kind of visibility, and eventually, someone notices. The owl of Minerva flies at dusk. But sometimes, if you pay attention to cognitive load and behavioral inconsistency, you can spot the lie before the day ends. The tracks look wrong. And wrong tracks are still tracks. They still lead somewhere. You just have to read them carefully. There was a god in Rome who would not move. His name was Terminus, and he was the god of boundaries. He marked where one property ended and another began, where one nation stopped and another started. He was represented by a stone, simple, unmovable, planted in the ground. When Jupiter became king of the gods, all the other deities relocated their shrines to make room for his grand temple on the Capitoline Hill. Every god agreed to move, except Terminus. He refused. Jupiter, the most powerful god, could not budge him. So they built the temple around Terminus. His shrine remained inside Jupiter's temple, a stone that would not yield. The Romans loved this story. It said something about limits, about the power of staying put. Modern psychology has rediscovered what Terminus represented. Boundaries are not weaknesses. They are structural necessities. Without them, Systems collapse, relationships fail, individuals burn out. The refusal to move, when done intentionally, is not stubbornness. It is integrity. Research on boundary setting shows that people with clear boundaries report higher well-being, lower stress, and better relationships. This seems counterintuitive. Flexibility is valued. Accommodation is praised. Saying no feels selfish. But boundaries are not about selfishness. They are about sustainability. If you say yes to everything, you eventually say yes to nothing effectively. You are stretched too thin. Your commitments become hollow. Terminus understood this. The boundary holds because it does not flex. Consider emotional boundaries. These are limits on what you will accept from others, how they speak to you, what demands they can make, what emotional labor you will provide. People with weak emotional boundaries become enmeshed in others' problems. They feel responsible for other people's feelings. They absorb stress that is not theirs to carry. This leads to compassion fatigue, anxiety, and resentment. Setting an emotional boundary means saying, "I care about your problem, but I cannot solve it for you." Or, "I will not engage when you speak to me that way." These statements feel harsh, but they are protective. They preserve your capacity to care in the long term. If you let every emotional demand cross your boundary, you deplete. Then you have nothing left, not for others, not for yourself. Terminus would not move for Jupiter, not because he did not respect Jupiter, but because moving would destroy what Terminus was. The boundary was his function. There are also time boundaries. How much of your day belongs to work? How much to family? How much to yourself? Without these, work expands to fill all available space. Parkinson's law states that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. If you do not set a limit, there is always more work. Another email, another task, another meeting. The boundary says, this is when work ends. Not because the work is finished. The work is never finished, but because the time allotted is complete. This requires enforcement. If you set a boundary but do not maintain it, the boundary disappears. People test limits. Not maliciously necessarily, they just push until they meet resistance. If you say you will not answer emails after 6, but then you answer an email at 7, the boundary is gone. You have signaled it is negotiable. Terminus did not negotiate. He stood. And because he stood, the boundary held. Psychologists talk about boundary violations. This is when someone crosses a limit you have set. Sometimes it is obvious. Someone reads your private messages. Someone makes a decision that affects you without consulting you. Sometimes it is subtle. Someone guilt trips you into changing your plans. Someone dismisses your feelings. These violations erode trust. They teach you that your boundaries do not matter. If you do not respond to violations, they continue. The person learns they can cross the line without consequence. Responding to violations does not mean aggression. It means clarity. You crossed a boundary I set. That is not acceptable. Here is what needs to do. Change. This is uncomfortable. Most people avoid confrontation. But avoiding confrontation often means accepting repeated violations. The short-term discomfort of addressing the issue prevents long-term resentment and relationship decay. Terminus did not explain himself endlessly. He simply did not move. The refusal was the message. There is also the concept of porous versus rigid boundaries. Porous boundaries let everything through. You cannot say no. You take on everyone's emotions and problems. You have no clear sense of where you end and others begin. Rigid boundaries let nothing through. You are closed off, isolated. You do not ask for help. You do not let people in. Neither extreme is healthy. Healthy boundaries are semi-permeable. They let in what is nourishing and keep out what is harmful. They flex in response to context but do not collapse. A friend in genuine crisis can cross certain boundaries temporarily. You make an exception. But the exception is conscious and temporary. You are not abandoning the boundary. You are choosing when to adjust it. Terminus would not move for Jupiter, but Romans still honored him. The boundary was not hostile. It was simply firm. One challenge is cultural messaging. Many cultures valorize self-sacrifice, especially for women, parents, caregivers. You are supposed to put others first. Boundaries can feel like selfishness. But self-sacrifice without limits leads to burnout. Then you cannot care for anyone. Airlines tell you to put on your own oxygen mask before helping others. This is not selfishness. It is pragmatism. You are no use to anyone if you pass out. Boundaries are your oxygen mask. They keep you functional. There is research on martyrdom and resentment. People who consistently ignore their own needs in favor of others often develop deep resentment. They feel taken for granted. They feel used. But they never communicated their limits. They just kept saying yes while silently suffering. The resentment poisons the relationship. A boundary, even if it causes short-term disappointment, prevents long-term poison. Saying no clearly is kinder than saying yes resentfully. Boundaries also communicate respect. When you set a boundary, you are saying, I have needs, I have limits, I matter. This models for others that they are allowed to do the same. Relationships where both people have clear boundaries are healthier than relationships where one person is endlessly accommodating. Accommodation breeds imbalance. Boundaries create equilibrium. Both people know where they stand. Expectations are clear. Terminus marked the line. Both sides knew where the property ended. That clarity prevented conflict. There is also the issue of guilt. Setting a boundary often triggers guilt, especially if the other person reacts with disappointment or anger. But guilt is not proof you did something wrong. It is just an emotion. Sometimes it signals a real violation. Sometimes it is the result of conditioning. You were taught that your needs do not matter, that saying no is bad, that boundary is guilt's attempt to pull you back into old patterns. Terminus did not feel guilty for refusing Jupiter. He simply was what he was, a boundary. One practical approach is to start small. If you have weak boundaries, setting a major limit immediately can feel overwhelming. Start with minor boundaries. I will not check my phone during dinner. I will not discuss work on Sundays. I will not lend money without a clear repayment plan. These are manageable. You can enforce them. Success with small boundaries builds confidence for larger ones. Each time you hold the line, you reinforce that your boundaries are real. Another tool is the boundary script. Prepare language in advance. I appreciate the invitation, but I am not available. I understand this is frustrating for you, but I cannot change my decision. I need some time alone right now. These phrases do not require justification. They do not invite negotiation. They simply state the boundary. Terminus did not argue his case. He was a stone. The stone said no by existing. There is a paradox here. Inflexibility sounds like a flaw. Adaptability is praised. But there are times when inflexibility is strength. When the boundary is essential, moving it is not compromise. It is collapse. A dam that flexes too much is not a dam. It is a leak. Terminus was not flexible. That was his virtue. He held the line so that everything else could function. Without him, property disputes were endless. With him, The boundary was clear. The system worked. The refusal to move can also signal value. If you move every boundary, people learn that nothing is sacred to you. If you hold certain boundaries firmly, people learn what matters to you. This shapes how they treat you. It shapes how you see yourself. You are not infinitely malleable. You have a core. You have limits. Those limits define you. Terminus was nothing but a boundary, but that boundary was powerful enough that even Jupiter could not erase it. In the end, boundaries are not about building walls. They are about knowing where you are, what you will accept, what you will not. They are about protecting the space you need to function, to care, to sustain yourself over time. They are about saying, this far and no farther, not out of cruelty, not out of rigidity, but out of the knowledge that without limits, everything dissolves. Terminus would not move, and because he would not move, Rome had order. The properties stayed separate, the boundaries held, and inside those boundaries, life continued. That is not obstinacy. That is structure, and structure, sometimes, is everything. Rome faced a crisis, war, plague, civil unrest. The senators did not know what to do, so they consulted the Sibylline books. These were prophetic texts, ancient and mysterious, kept under guard in the temple of Jupiter. Only a select group of priests could read them. And they only opened the books in moments of dire need. The prophecies were not clear. They were cryptic, ambiguous. They pointed in directions without specifying destinations. Do this ritual. Make this sacrifice. Honor this foreign god. The instructions were strange, often vague, but the Romans followed them. The books had authority not because they were precise, but because they were sacred and scarce. In the absence of certainty, the ambiguous guidance became the anchor. Modern psychology has a term for what was happening: anchoring. When you face a decision under uncertainty, your mind latches onto any available information, even if that information is arbitrary or incomplete. That initial piece of information becomes the anchor. It shapes all subsequent judgments. You adjust from it, but you do not abandon it. The anchor holds even when it should not. The classic experiment was done by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. They spun a wheel of fortune in front of participants. The wheel was rigged, landing on either 10 or 65. Then they asked participants to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. People who saw the wheel land on 10 gave much lower estimates than people who saw 65. The wheel was random. It had nothing to do with African nations, but it became the anchor. Participants adjusted from that number. The arbitrary starting point shaped the answer. This happens constantly. A salary negotiation starts with an opening offer. That offer becomes the anchor. Even if it is unreasonable, all subsequent offers orbit around it. A house is listed at a certain price. That price anchors buyer expectations. Even if the house is overpriced, buyers think in terms of discounts from that initial number. The first number sets the frame. Everything else adjusts. The Sibylline books work the same way. They provided an initial direction. That direction became the reference point. Other options were not seriously considered. The question was not whether to follow the books. It was how to interpret them. The anchor was set. The Romans adjusted their understanding, but they stayed tethered to the prophetic text. Anchoring is especially powerful under uncertainty. When you do not know what to do, any guidance feels better than none, even if the guidance is vague, even if it is questionable. The human mind dislikes ambiguity. It wants a reference point. The Sibylline books provided that. They said, "This is what you should consider." And once the consideration was framed, The decision space narrowed. Other possibilities faded. The books had spoken. There is a related concept called information scarcity. When information is rare, it gains disproportionate weight. The Sibylline books were not consulted regularly. They were opened only in crisis. This scarcity increased their perceived value. If the books were read every day, they would lose power. Familiarity breeds contempt, or at least indifference. But something rare, something guarded, something revealed only at critical moments, that commands attention. The scarcity is part of the signal. It says, "This information is important. You should listen." Modern marketing exploits this relentlessly. Limited edition. Only 3 left in stock. Offer expires at midnight. These are artificial scarcity cues. They create urgency. They anchor your perception of value. The item might not actually be rare, but the framing makes it feel rare, and that feeling drives behavior. The Sibylline books were genuinely scarce. Only a few priests could access them. This was not marketing, but the psychological effect was the same. Scarcity conferred authority. Ambiguity also plays a role. The prophecies in the Sibylline books were not specific. They required interpretation. This made them flexible. No matter what happened, the prophecy could be read as accurate. If Rome won the war, the ritual worked. If Rome lost, the interpretation was wrong or the ritual was not performed correctly. The prophecy itself could not be falsified. This is how oracles survive. Vagueness is not a weakness. It is a feature. It allows the anchor to hold regardless of outcome. Psychologists call this the Barnum effect, named after the showman P.T. Barnum. People accept vague, general statements as personally meaningful. Horoscopes work this way. You are sometimes insecure but generally confident. You have untapped potential. These statements apply to almost everyone, but they feel specific. The ambiguity lets you fill in the details. You anchor to the general statement and adjust it to fit your life. The Sibylline books were operating on a societal scale. The vague prophecy became the anchor. Romans filled in the interpretation. There is danger here. Anchoring can lead to bad decisions. If the initial anchor is wrong, all subsequent adjustments are off. Salary negotiations anchored to an unrealistic number waste time. Medical diagnoses anchored to an initial incorrect guess lead to misdiagnosis. Investment decisions anchored to purchase price lead to holding losing stocks too long. The anchor distorts judgment. But people are very bad at recognizing when an anchor is arbitrary or misleading. One way to counter anchoring is to generate alternatives before seeing any initial number or suggestion. If you are negotiating salary, decide your range before hearing the offer. If you are diagnosing a patient, list possible causes before settling on one. If you are making an investment, determine your criteria before looking at current prices. This pre-commitment reduces the power of the anchor. You have your own reference point. The external anchor still influences you, but less so. Romans could not do this with the Sibylline books. The crisis was already happening. They were desperate. They needed guidance. So they opened the books and accepted what they found. The anchor was set in desperation. And desperation makes you less critical. You grab on to whatever is available. The Sibylline books were available, so they became the answer. There is also the sunk cost fallacy, which interacts with anchoring. Once Romans followed the guidance of the books, they were invested. They had performed rituals, made sacrifices. If the crisis did not resolve immediately, they did not abandon the books. They doubled down. Maybe the ritual was not done correctly. Maybe more was needed. The initial anchor, once accepted, becomes hard to release. You have committed to it. Walking away feels like admitting the commitment was wasted. This happens in personal decisions constantly. You stay in a bad relationship because you have already invested years. You continue a failing project because you have already spent money. The initial decision becomes the anchor. All subsequent decisions orbit around justifying it. The Sibylline books anchored Roman crisis response. Once consulted, they shaped not just the immediate action, but the interpretation of results. If things went well, the books were validated. If things went poorly, the interpretation needed adjustment, but the books themselves remained authoritative. Interestingly, ambiguous guidance can reduce decision paralysis. When faced with too many clear options, people freeze. Analysis paralysis sets in. But when guidance is vague, it provides direction without overwhelming specificity. The Sibylline books said, "Honor this God." They did not specify every detail. This left room for Roman leaders to implement in ways that felt manageable. The anchor was set, but execution had flexibility. This balance can be effective. Too much clarity can be as paralyzing as too much ambiguity. There is research showing that people often prefer ambiguous information in high-stakes situations. Clear information can be threatening. If you know exactly what the odds are, and they are bad, you feel helpless. But if the information is ambiguous, you can interpret it optimistically. You can believe you are in the better scenario. The Sibylline books allowed this. The prophecy could be read as hopeful. Rome could believe the gods were on their side. The ambiguity was a feature, not a bug. But this creates vulnerability to manipulation. If people anchor to vague, scarce information, those who control that information hold power. The priests who interpreted the Sibylline books had immense influence. They decided what the books meant. They could shape Roman policy by shaping interpretation. This was not necessarily corrupt, but it was a concentration of power. The anchor point was controlled by a few. Everyone else adjusted from it. Modern institutions have similar structures. Central banks release statements that markets anchor to. Supreme courts issue rulings that frame legal interpretation. Religious leaders provide guidance that shapes behavior. These are anchors. They set reference points. People adjust from them. And the people who set the anchors wield disproportionate influence. The Sibylline books were an ancient version of this dynamic. Scarce information, controlled access, ambiguous content. The recipe for powerful anchoring. One lesson is to be aware of your anchors. When you are making a decision, ask what information arrived first. Ask whether that information is arbitrary. Ask who benefits from you anchoring to it. This does not mean rejecting all anchors. Some are useful, some are accurate. But awareness reduces their unconscious influence. You can choose to accept or reject the anchor rather than automatically adjusting from it. The Sibylline books eventually burned. They were destroyed in a fire. Rome had to reconstruct them from memory and from other sources. The loss was considered catastrophic, but Rome survived. It turned out the books were not essential. They were an anchor, and anchors can be replaced. Rome found new reference points, new guidance systems. The specific books mattered less than the function they served. They provided a starting point in uncertainty. Once that function was understood, other mechanisms could fill it. In the end, the Sibylline books were not magic. They were psychology. They gave desperate people a place to anchor. They reduced the overwhelming space of possibilities to a manageable path. They worked not because they predicted the future accurately, but because they shaped how Romans thought about the future. The anchor held. And sometimes, in the storm of uncertainty, an anchor is all you need. Not to guarantee success, but to give you something to hold on to while you figure out what to do next. Every place in Rome had a spirit, not metaphorically, literally in Roman belief. If you walked into a grove, a spirit lived there. If you stood by a spring, a spirit resided in it. If you entered a building, a spirit occupied that space. These were not gods in the grand sense. They were localized presences. The genius loci, the spirit of the place. This was not decoration. It shaped how Romans moved through the world. A place was not neutral. It had character, intention, memory. You did not just occupy a location. You entered into relationship with it. You honored it. You acknowledged its presence, and in return, the place held you. It shaped your behavior, your thoughts, your sense of who you were. Modern psychology has rediscovered this under different names: environmental psychology, place attachment, embodied cognition. The research confirms what Romans intuited. Places are not backdrops. They are active participants in your mental life. Where you are shapes what you think, how you feel, and who you become. Consider place attachment theory. This examines how people form emotional bonds with locations. A childhood home, a favorite park, a city you lived in during a formative period. These places are not interchangeable. They carry meaning. They hold memories. When you return to them, something shifts. You are not just visiting a location. You are reconnecting with a part of yourself that exists only there. The genius loci is still present, and it recognizes you. Research shows that people with strong place attachment report higher well-being. They have a sense of rootedness, stability, identity. The place is part of their story. It reflects who they are. This is especially true for natural places. People who spend time in a particular landscape, a forest they return to, a beach they have visited for years, develop a relationship with that space. It becomes part of their identity. I am someone who belongs to this place, and this place belongs to me. But place attachment can also create grief. When a place changes or disappears, people mourn. Not just the physical loss, the loss of the relationship. Gentrification displaces people not just from housing, but from the places that held their identity. Natural disasters destroy not just buildings but the spirits of those places. The genius loci is gone, and with it, a piece of the self that was anchored there. This grief is real and deep. It is called solastalgia. Nostalgia for a place you are still in, but that has been altered beyond recognition. Places also shape cognition in immediate ways. The same person thinks differently in different environments. A study by Kathleen Vose and colleagues found that people in a messy room generated more creative ideas than people in a tidy room. The disorder somehow freed thinking. A tidy room, in contrast, promoted conventional behavior and healthier choices. The place was cueing certain mental states. The genius loci of mess said, break rules. The genius loci of order said, conform. Architecture exploits this. Cathedrals have high ceilings because height evokes awe and transcendence. The genius loci of a cathedral is vertical. It pulls your thoughts upward. Courtrooms are designed to intimidate. The judge sits elevated. The space is formal and rigid. The genius loci says, authority matters here. You are being judged. Casinos remove windows and clocks. The genius loci is timeless. You lose track of hours. You stay longer. You gamble more. Romans understood this when they built their temples and forums. Space was designed to evoke specific states. A temple was not just a structure. It was a container for the sacred. The genius loci was divine presence. You walked in and your behavior shifted. You spoke quietly. You moved with reverence. The place told you how to be. Even mundane spaces shape you. Your desk, your kitchen, your commute. Each has a genius loci, a quality that influences you. A cluttered desk might signal stress or creativity depending on context. A kitchen with family photos might evoke warmth and connection. A long commute through ugly sprawl might drain you daily. These are not neutral backdrops. They are active forces shaping your mental state. There is research on restorative environments. Certain places reduce mental fatigue. Nature is the most studied. Time in natural settings lowers stress hormones, improves mood, and restores attention. Rachel and Stephen Kaplan developed attention restoration theory. They argue that urban environments demand directed attention. You have to focus, you have to navigate, you have to filter noise. This depletes your attentional resources. Natural environments, in contrast, engage effortless attention. You can let your mind wander. The place holds you without demanding effort. The genius loci of nature is restorative. This is why people seek parks, forests, beaches when they are burned out. They are not just escaping. They are seeking a place whose spirit restores what was lost. Romans built gardens and retreats for this reason. They knew that some places healed. The genius loci could give back what daily life took away. But not all natural places are restorative. A barren desert can feel hostile. A dense jungle can feel oppressive. The quality matters. Research suggests that restorative environments have 4 characteristics. They feel away, a sense of escape. They have extent, enough space to engage your mind. They have fascination, things that capture attention effortlessly. And they have compatibility. They match what you need in that moment. The genius loci must align with your state. Otherwise, the place does not restore, it conflicts. Places also carry historical weight. A battlefield, a site of tragedy, a memorial. These places hold collective memory. The genius loci is shaped by what happened there. People report feeling different when they visit Auschwitz or Ground Zero or Gettysburg. The place carries the weight of its history. This is not superstition. It is a psychological response to knowing what occurred. The genius loci is informed by narrative. The story of the place shapes how you experience it. This has implications for architecture and urban planning. If places shape cognition and identity, then designing places is not just about function or aesthetics. It is about shaping human experience. Badly designed spaces make people miserable. Hostile architecture that prevents sitting or resting says, "You do not belong here." Surveillance-heavy spaces create paranoia. The genius loci is hostile. People respond by avoiding or by becoming guarded. Good design creates places where people thrive. Parks with benches invite rest. Streets with wide sidewalks invite walking. Buildings with natural light improve mood. The genius loci is welcoming. It says, "You are safe here. You can relax." This is not luxury. It is basic human need. Places that do not meet that need damage the people who occupy them. There is also the concept of third places. These are spaces that are not home and not work. Coffee shops, libraries, community centers. These places provide social connection without obligation. The genius loci is communal but not demanding. You can be alone together. Research shows that people with access to third places report stronger community ties and lower loneliness. The place facilitates connection. It holds the space for encounter without forcing it. Modern life often lacks third places. Suburban sprawl isolates. Car culture eliminates casual encounters. Digital interaction replaces physical presence. The genius loci of many contemporary environments is isolation. People feel this as loneliness, but do not always recognize the spatial component. The places they inhabit are not designed for connection. The spirit of those places is solitary. Romans had forums, public baths, marketplaces. These were third places embedded in daily life. You encountered neighbors. You participated in civic life. The genius loci was collective. It reminded you that you were part of something larger. Modern equivalents are rarer and often commercialized. You can be in public, but the place is not truly communal. It is transactional. The genius loci is commercial, not civic. There is also personal space, your home, your room, the places most saturated with your presence. These accumulate meaning over time. Objects, arrangements, memories. The genius loci becomes deeply personal. It reflects you. It holds you. When you leave that space for long periods, you can feel unmoored. When you return, you feel grounded. The place knows you. This is why displacement is so traumatic. Refugees, evictions, forced relocations. You lose not just a physical space, but the genius loci that held your identity. You have to rebuild that elsewhere. And some people never fully do. Part of them remains attached to the lost place. The spirit is still there, waiting, but they cannot return. In a more positive sense, creating space is an act of self-definition. How you arrange your environment says something about who you are and who you want to become. A desk facing a window invites contemplation. A desk facing a wall invites focus. Neither is right or wrong, but each cultivates a different genius. Loci. You are shaping the spirit of the place, and that spirit will shape you in return. Romans made offerings to the genius loci when entering important spaces. This was acknowledgement. I see you. I respect you. Modern secular life has mostly abandoned this, but the impulse remains. People feel it when they enter a space that matters. A pause, a shift in attention, an unconscious adjustment of behavior. The place is speaking, and you are listening, even if you do not name it as such. In the end, genius loci is about recognizing that place is not passive. It is alive with influence. It shapes mood, thought, identity, and behavior. The Romans personified this influence as spirits. Modern psychology maps it as environmental effects and place attachment. The language differs. The reality is the same. Where you are matters. The places you inhabit leave marks on you, and you leave marks on them. The exchange is constant. The relationship is real. And understanding it means understanding that you are never just yourself. You are always yourself in a place. And the place is part of the equation. Ignore it, and you miss half the story. Honor it, like the Romans did, and you begin to see how deeply location and identity are intertwined. The genius loci is still there. It has been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to shape you, waiting to be shaped in return.